less or more. I am not so sure, but I guess the wisdom of my senses will explore. And then I says,
Do you record everything that's ever on? Do you ever do on Zoom?
No, almost, but not quite. No, I speak to family members and stuff. It's not always business.
Cool. How are you doing?
Okay, I've been encountering some frustrations with this latest book. I'm sure you can relate, like trying to get a publisher and meeting the world's indifference again.
Well, I mean, I'm incredibly impressed that you got those 3 books out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's like, in the space of however many years, it's pretty impressive.
Well, I can certainly write them, and it's true, I did find a publisher. In that case, I mean, I haven't approached Aeon just because I was just hoping to find a publisher that would get them into bookshops. They essentially maybe get reviews. I was trying.
You mean like slightly more mainstream?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, and I was told had the most honest rejection I ever got recently from an agent, telling me that if he were to represent this book, he would be biting the hand that feeds him, and that he thought it would be the same for any publishers, that they would if my theory was correct, they would never publish it, or they would give me a big advance and bury it.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this it could potentially that's a good topic of conversation. I mean, to what extent is there a self-fulfilling prophecy in naming the beast?
Yeah, well, it certainly caused me to reconsider at least my how I present it. How I describe what the book is, because that's of course what I have to do to try and get it published, and it's never going to accurately represent the book. You can never get it quite right. It's a bit arbitrary, isn't it, when you try and sum up a work, because if it really could be summed up, you wouldn't have to write the book, right?
That's true. Right. But you've got the Vice of Kings is potentially very controversial too. I mean, and there could have been resistance to that. I mean,
yeah.
Unless there is, you really have tapped into some higher level of occult bureaucracy and whatever it is that those powers that you're writing about, and you have your sights set on, as it were.
I mean, that's one way of looking at it, and I don't rule that out, because that is part of my thesis, that there are secret societies and controlling everything, but I definitely try and downplay that, because for various reasons. But the other end of it that I focus on more is that even at an individual level, what I'm saying is threatening and disturbing and hard to believe, such as that the entertainment media, the culture itself is. Have you read Jacques Ellul, Propaganda?
I haven't. I know of it, but I haven't. It was in the it was on reading list, in the past, but I never read it. No.
I just read it, and it's very useful, and by no stretch of imagination is what he writes there would it ever be called conspiracy theory. It's more philosophical, but he's talking about the nature of propaganda and what he calls sociological propaganda, and how the nature of the modern world is propaganda. Propaganda is central to the modern world, the way that it functions and operates. Essentially, he's saying everything is propaganda, but obviously he's saying it in a way that doesn't just cancel itself out. He's explaining it and describing it. So, I mean, when I write a book, when I describe a book that is essentially about how Hollywood and movies and TV shows are all part of a great propaganda machine that's turning us into zombie slaves, like in the movie They Live, that yeah, that's on the one hand that can seem paranoid if it isn't unpacked for the nuance, and
Mm-hmm.
conspiracy theory. So that's all. But on the other hand, also it's like, well, who wants to really see that, particularly if you're an agent or you're a publisher, and essentially it does. And then the political aspect is, yeah, there is a kind of media mafia.
Yeah, I think we have this conversation keeps recurring, and maybe you see the idea that we construct our realities, or that realities are constructed by a combination of factors, partly our own perceptual apparatuses, our own inner workings, neuronal inner workings, which themselves are constructed by particular languages we use and the particular influences that have shaped us. So we have an inner structure which has been constructed by an outer structure, this relay between the inner and the outer, to the extent that therefore our conceptions and perceptions of the world are inextricably linked to those outer apparatuses and systems. And it's very difficult, if you start to think carefully about those things, how to differentiate what's your own thought, what's the thought that has been received by social conditioning and programming and media, and how you find a chink in the armor of that, if that's a metaphor to use.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are deeply in the matrix now. Is to use again something that you're an analogy you're very familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And my sense is that more and more people are feeling this sense that of there sort of a reality disturbance of the kind that Philip K. Dick wrote about and experienced, since from the 1950s onwards, if not before. But he really explored this, I think, and his fictions explored it, the reality breakdowns, the inside-outside confusion, the loss of sense of self, all those things
Yeah.
have been on the cards, as it were, for a long time. And I think we're quite deep into it now. And I think a lot of people are realizing it, or experiencing something like this radical uncertainty about the nature of reality.
Yeah, so in reality construction is, as you're saying, there are many layers or levels to that. So at the deepest level, like in terms of our perceptual faculties, we are always constructing reality, and that can be hijacked by trauma, or just by natural circumstances and so on. But it also can be consciously hijacked by other human beings. So then there is this spectrum between, you could say, the postmodern perspective, and even beyond that, the spiritual perspective that we're not what we think we are. We're infinite consciousness having an experience through these filters and so on. There's all kinds of models for that are more acceptable. And then another sort of pole there, which is more, I guess it's more reductionist, but it's the conspiracy theory. Actually, both of these come together with something like David Icke. It's that there are these groups and agencies who are constructing reality around us and manipulating our perceptions. And then there's this whole era in between, which is unmapped. I mean, it's relatively easy to, if you really simplify something and you reduce it to kind of basic principles, then it's relatively easy to map it. Not that postmodernism is simple by any means, or spirituality for that matter, but it's quite abstract anyway. I guess at one end of the spectrum, this very abstract thing of postmodernism and spiritual inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
on the other end, you got the very concrete thing, which is David Icke kind of conspiracy theory, which reduces it to a literal system of control. Or even, it is a weird time, isn't it? Because you even got somebody like Elon Musk claiming to believe that we're in a simulation, which is the ultimate conspiracy theory. Really, that's saying the whole of our reality, that's David Icke, and the whole of our reality is just fabricated to trick us.
Yeah.
And that's, that's kind of mainstream. But anyway, where I'm at is trying to map, because it seems to me that we're always trying to, if we can't find the ground, we're trying to have a sense of knowing where the ground is. So we're always creating narratives that actually reassure us, even if they're like the Matrix movie. I mean, that's like, you don't know what to, nothing is real, but it's a movie, so it's actually reassuring. It gives you a sense of coherence. David Icke is reassuring, I think. He must be. He wouldn't be so popular otherwise.
Well, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? The Matrix is reassuring as a movie, so long as you don't think it's not only a movie. Like the beginning of, it's like the trailer for Last House on the Left, keep reminding yourself it's only a movie. It's only a movie. It's only a movie. Brilliantly hypnotic device for actually, luring you into the sense it's not only a movie. And of course, the weird thing about Last House on the Left is that the kind of violence that it depicted wasn't unknown to the world, let's say.
And now it isn't only a movie. Like, that kind of footage is available on the internet, I guess.
Yeah. But someone like, if you see Phil when Phil went to America, he went to France. Well, I think the one time Phil Dick went to France, and he was quite deep in the Vallis mindset. And so some footage of it where the audience, and I can't remember who his partner was at the time, but they sort of slightly feel uncomfortable when he starts to deliver the Matrix scenario, in full sincerity, that we are living in a simulated artificial construct, and this is kind of Dick at his most Gnostic.
Yeah, well, it was an interesting moment in his career, and there is something, and I guess this is where I'm at with this book. Maybe there is something inherently contradictory about telling people that nothing is real, because then what you're saying isn't real either. It cancels itself out.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If this is true, then talking about it can't possibly be the way to address it. There's got to be, how do you actually navigate an idea like that, or an interpretation of reality like that? So, like, for me, with this book, like, why am I even writing a book that's saying that culture is a means of manipulating our perception to keep us enslaved, to a system that is unreal? What exactly am I trying to do there? Am I just trying to turn it into entertainment myself? And I mean, what's my goal? What is my goal? Like, why do I want to write books? Why do I want them to be published? Why do I want them to be reviewed? Simple answer is I want to communicate. I want to reach people. But why do I feel I have to use the machinery of the control system to do it, including language? Because
it's fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating journey that you're on. Moving through Strieber and communion and trauma, and his backstory, your own backstory. You've kind of, the feeling is that kind of you're reversing into this somehow. It's like it's a bit like Benjamin's Angel of History. I've never really understood it, but it's being blown back from these winds of the future. It's all kind of back to front, as it were, in terms of temporality and causality, and what causes what compelled you,
right,
in the forward motion. you know, and you looked back and to say, well, what's behind that event that compelled me to move in a certain direction, and you've turned around to look backwards as to what the deeper causes might be that, you know, created that, well, network of coincidences or associations. I mean, I don't know your story well enough to know precisely at what point the reflections on violent films coincided with the Streberian horror covered memory.
Horror. And I wasn't drawn to his horror. I was drawn to the alien face.
To the
The
alien.
face on the cover of Communion. It's like, oh, I know that face. I've got to find out more about this.
Is it an image of the grey?
Except it's not grey.
Okay.
Sort of beige coloured. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't literally that I saw the face, but it was literally that I was made aware of Strieber in my early 20s, and I remember, I used to be into UFOs, and I could talk about it. What's that about? And let's find out. Let's go back to it. You know, like I was pulled back to it by Strieber. Like his voice was quite authentic in the early days. It came out less. So yeah, I
remember.
Obviously, it's the unknown object.
I went to see a guy many years ago who gave a talk about close encounters, you know, C1, C2, C3 experiences, and the difference. I can't remember, you know, the difference of levels of abduction experience. I can't remember who the author was. He was writing on it. He was deeply involved. And there was a moment in the talk where he announced he was going to show us an image that was the image that would trigger people who may have been abducted. And for me, it was a very obvious piece of theatrical hypnotic stagecraft, but it no doubt worked on some people. And the image that he suddenly lifted and showed to the audience was the image of the grey. So he had there's probably a word for this, there is a word, I can't remember, but he'd prepared the audience to receive a certain kind of symbolic shock, or a certain kind of, he'd already set the scenario for the recovered memory trigger.
Yeah.
And then presented an iconic image which we all somehow unconsciously recognize. Maybe not everybody unconsciously.
In the 80s, was it, or later?
This will have been it must have been in the 90s.
90s, yeah, because it was Communion that really introduced that face. Not that it had never been seen at all, but it was certainly pre-X-Files. Like X-Files made it. You know.
Well, it was E.T.
But E.T. isn't the grey.
No, it wasn't. But it's a kind of
Close Encounters. Yeah, it's true.
Close Encounters.
Yeah. Even Close Encounters isn't quite, because they didn't have the almond eyes.
Yeah. But there was a lot of work on this, and I remember reading, I can't remember the book now, there was a book that about, I mean, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that it was all familiar to me in the 90s. In the books that I was reading, there was a whole, you know, a lot of people were making crop circles. It was associated with, I can't remember the guy's name. There was a famous guy who wrote several books on UFO. I think one was called Dark Light.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to go and look that up again. But so I was quite aware of the dynamics of this kind of close encounters abduction scenario, you know, back then, but I'd kind of forgotten about it too. But anyway, no, I'm not saying anything much here apart from the trigger that you received from the cover of Communion. You're saying that was the thing that really...
Well, it was an interview with Strieber, but there was probably a picture, I'm almost certainly a picture of the cover in the interview of the magazine that I found in Mexico. and I'd gone to Mexico because of Castaneda. So it's pretty interesting. I went there looking for sorcerers, and I found Whitley Strieber.
But there was lots of people when I was in Mexico. I've just been. This is coincidental, but nothing's a coincidence, obviously. I've been remembering a place I visited in Mexico called the Lagos de Montebello, which is on the border of Guatemala and Mexico. And I was there with my partner in, I guess, 1995, 96. And it's a beautiful place. And there's a pyramid there called Chincoteac. And back then in the 90s, there was tons of people who were expecting the aliens to land in a UFO.
Mm-hmm.
And they were there waiting for them, the Rainbow Tribe, I think they were called. And there was a very strong sense of interplanetary astral communication, the whole chariot of the gods type thinking. There were people genuinely, believed that aliens had been communicating with those extraterrestrials for thousands of years, and that they were about to make their presence felt in a big way. And they were hanging around pyramids waiting for spaceships to land. So, that was all very familiar to me in the 90s. There was a big culture of psychedelically informed extraterrestrial expectation going on.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was in Mexico when you were there, if that was in the ether.
Yeah, I was aware of it for sure. I read, one of the books that was a turning point for me in that period. There were three. Well, one was an album, Talking Heads Naked. So I was hugely into Talking Heads, and that was their last album that came out during this period. The other was Watchmen, the Alan Moore comic book, which has this, ends with this faked alien landing invasion. Oh wait, I just dreamt about this last night. I dreamt I was doing last night.
I was watching the Watchmen cartoon last night.
Oh, I didn't know there was a cartoon.
Animated comic.
Oh, yeah, I dreamt I was doing about this with Oliver Stone of all people. Anyway, there was that, and then there was the Starseed Transmissions by this guy Ken Carey, and there was a sequel to it called I can't remember what the sequel was called, but that was even more effective. And now I would look back on that stuff as New Age channeled, not garbage, but just kind of generic. I mean, there's so much of that stuff. Actually, I didn't know at the time, but the same person who recommended Castaneda to me, Lynn Burke, this astrologer, also recommended Ken Carey's Starseed Transmissions, and it was about the New Age and intergalactic intelligence and all of that stuff.
Jose Arguelles, The Mayan Factor. Did you ever come across that?
I definitely came across him, for sure. It was a bit later, but I never got into him.
That was all the 2012 stuff.
The harmonic convergence, yeah. I know. Kenner was doing the 2012 stuff. So there was a huge confluence or convergence of different individuals and different narratives and beliefs and books, and because now I would suspect strongly, as Prisoner of Infinity gets into, that a lot of it was orchestrated deliberately behind the scenes. And this whole thing about creating audience cults that William Sims Bainbridge writes about, the UFO is very central to that, but it overlaps in various different ways with these other things, including the kind of quantum spirituality of connecting to the universe via this hierarchy of space brothers. And I think that meme is still alive. I think it constantly gets upgraded, and I think it's being upgraded as we speak with something like American Cosmic, which came out after Prisoner of Infinity, so I couldn't include it, but that's Diana Pasulka. She studied under Jeffrey Kripal, as did Eric Davis. They're all religious studies people, and American Cosmic is about how the UFO is a technological expression of God, of the divine.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually nothing new. It's the same old story, but it's been upgraded. It's actually quite a well-written book. It's quite persuasive, and I'm just as skeptical as I can be at this point, and I found myself having doubts. But all of this is converging with AI now, with the human technology.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's all. I guess it's I guess to bring it to a practical thing is what should we talk about? Because what we're engaged in with our conversations, but and with my writing, and I'm not sure with your writing because I'm not sure what you're working on, but it's really sort of trying to get to the core of what's happening now, right? So wherever we start, we can end up. There's so many different places you can end up. See what I mean? So even if you just reduce it to the 3 books that I've written recently, they're all actually, even though I see them as a trilogy, almost as very consistent, they're very divergent subject matter. Right? UFOs, organized.
Okay, well, occultism. For me, I have these little moments of insight, and the thing that keeps coming back, and it's from the beginning in terms of our communication, is it's so very funny. I was reading Prisoner of Infinity, and I realized that you'd written something, and I kept looking back for it in the text, and I read several pages that I'd read, the last 10, 15 pages, and I was trying to look for this expression that you had, because it coincided very precisely with a theory I have. It's not so much a theory, that a way I've described my own thinking and methods, which is paranoid critical theory. So I have this thing called paranoid critical theory. And when you write about cultural engineering, that's very close to what I call paranoid critical theory.
Okay.
And just to simplify and summarize what paranoid critical theory is, it's a combination of paranoid critical, which was the method Salvador Dali developed for making art, which was linked to this idea of pareidolia, or seeing into things, or allowing oneself to see differently. Very simply, you get Dali's work, right? It happens a lot. You look around it, you may see a face. It's like this deep dream stuff. In fact, deep dream software is doing precisely, I think, a paranoid critical. It's a paranoid critical technology in a Dali sense. It's a separate story, but I'm not sure if you know about deep dream. But the AI is programmed to see, for instance, dog faces. That's all it's to, where it can combine elements to see dog faces, and so it sees dog faces everywhere because it's got a dog face program, if you like. So that's paranoid critical, but the connection is with critical theory, which is the Frankfurt School. So this paranoid critical theory is putting the paranoia into critical theory, which was the thing that Marxists didn't like, or famously Frederick Jameson. I don't know how the exact way he describes paranoia, but a poor man's something or other. But there's a sense that paranoia is a bourgeois, delusional, unrealistic kind of mode, or a delusional, or it's associated with psychopathology.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never been able to really separate out critical theory from paranoid critical, like the delusional, the phantasmatic, the how do I know what I'm seeing is actually real, and why would I believe the Marxists?
What is the critical in paranoid critical then? Why is that term in Dali's model? Where does the critical aspect come in?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have to dig deeper into that. I mean, Dali's paranoid critical yeah, it's a different meaning of critical than critical theory. It would be interesting to unpack why. For me, the critical was the bridge between Dali's paranoid critical method and critical theory. But it's to do with the historical relationship between the critical theorists and the surrealists, and the relationship between Salvador Dali and Lacan. And Jacques Lacan's theories are deeply influenced by Salvador Dali, and they had a reciprocal relationship there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's to do with a kind of historical set of interests in surrealism, and its anti-realistic concern for delusional in mental states. You
mean it's interest in them as avenues to surreality, to a higher,
to surreality, and to challenging and transforming the dominant reality picture. In surrealism's political goal was to say the world is not what you think it is. It's not what it seems. It may be radically different than you imagine it, or your imagination might transform it. It's the idea of using the power of the imagination to transform the real. That, to me, is the great lesson of surrealism, that the world is only as it seems to be if you comply with the dominant reality picture. But if you challenge and undermine and subvert the dominant reality picture, you can change reality.
Well, this subject came out in a recent podcast. I don't know if you listened to it, the one about Blake.
I didn't, but I will.
And I'm aware we can get pulled into discussion so quickly and easily here. I mean, maybe it's the only way to proceed for us, I don't know. But I mean, maybe this is a rich area to focus on. The idea of using the imagination to transform reality, Hitler comes to mind right away. I know you're not supposed to mention Hitler in any discussion, you lose it immediately. But that would seem to be the very kind of observable Nazism. Like, it was a very imaginative movement. It had this religious quality to it, and it was about transcending and so on. And surrealism has become more and more suspicious. I've become more and more suspicious of surrealism because of what the researches I've been doing for this book, and the more I've been finding out about how surrealism such as Man Ray converges with violence and murder and torture with George Hodel and the Black Dahlia. It's just one flashpoint. So then, when in my 20s, when I read Buñuel's The Last Breath, and I was into Buñuel, I was never really into Dali, and André Breton, both of them saying that murder was the highest expression. Well, Breton saying that shooting...
the ultimate surrealist act is to run into a street with a revolver shooting randomly into the crowd.
That thing. And Buñuel, I'd forgotten this, but saying that Ishan Andalou was a call to murder. Back in my 20s, I thought that was really cool, and it was always just metaphorical. But now I understand it a lot better, that you can't say something's metaphorical if you're saying that metaphor is more real than reality. If you're talking about surreality, the realm of the imagination is more real than this, then you've got to consider that they mean it literally. Or at a certain point that becomes a literal thing, because it's saying that this reality isn't reality, it's that higher reality. Therefore, to commit murder in this realm is a transcendental act, because you're pledging your allegiance to higher reality. And that's in the Matrix. They kill people left, right, and center because they're not real. And somebody like Crowley, I think, embodies that. Like, he was trying to transgress and commit brutal, just terrible acts within this reality as a way to get free. So I think that, there's this whole thing where the imagination becomes, and Prisoner Infinity is about this, it gets shackled to trauma and dissociation, and it becomes this unconscious, desperate bid to get free from something that actually ends up expressing through violence. Whereas the other view of imagination, and maybe this does come back then to a different aspect to paranoid critical or reading one's dreams, is to use the imagination not to transform reality but to discover reality. As in, reality is something we can't see because our senses have been hijacked and compromised, or whatever else these traumatic filters have been put on us. So then we have to imagine the way reality might be as a way to intuit our way towards it. But that would be very passive. I would say that's a passive use of the imagination as compared to the surrealist, which was very active, almost in a literal way. Well, in a literal way, as in images like slicing the eyeball open. Like that image itself is obviously a violent image, but then also making a film with that image is a violent act. So they're trying to attack our senses.
Yeah, the shock tactics, the violence, the trauma, that was all, very, it's a strong part of surrealism. And it's, that's what I spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to work out, the relationship between the violent acts of the untrammeled imagination and the socially transformative ones, or the ones that don't necessarily involve. The whole question of violence and the necessity of violence for social transformation is a huge topic. For me, as a young person, encountering surrealism was really important because it was the first time I'd realized that there was that you could use your imagination to create worlds, and that was a valid and legitimate thing to do visually. I'm talking about Magritte and Dali, Paul Delvaux, I don't know, Max Ernst, and it was as a young person, very simply, it opened the doors to art, really. That's what it did, and that was a really just an encounter which has never really gone away. I mean, my whole life has been shaped by an idea that reality is a kind of imposition by extrinsic forces, political, ideological, paternal, legal, the law, the police, all these things which construct an orthodox and repressive notion of reality. I'm not saying I agree necessarily with this now, but I've agreed with that most of my life.
Yeah.
And I think the reason that idea began with surrealism. Nothing before surrealism gave me the idea, apart from maybe David Bowie, that the world didn't have to be what they told you it was. They being any authority figure, or the whole network of so-called authority figures.
And so then art became, and the use of the imagination became a weapon or a tool to get free from the imposition of reality.
And that's where the critical thing comes in, because it also became a means of criticizing or challenging or pointing out the deficits, the gaps, the hypocrisy and absurdities of the dominant reality picture.
Right. Which is different. I mean, critical theory, I don't know about critical theory per se, but the critical method and analysis of culture and society and stuff is distinct from the use of the imagination to create art.
I mean, that's why I think we keep coming back to Phil Dick. He clearly used his imagination to have visions of the future and intergalactic space travel and mind control.
Yeah.
And these were evidently criticisms of the world that he knew, the world he was living in. Contemporary California was he felt it to be a very repressive, pseudo emancipated society, addicted to various drugs and various cults, and that was the world that he chose to use science fiction to make a stab at, or make at least, to criticize.
Well, I always felt with Dick that right to the end, it became more apparent to the end that he was really driven primarily by the attempt to understand himself and reality, and that criticism was inseparable from that. Certainly he felt oppressed and was aware of being oppressed and so on. But I always still feel that something about Dick that makes him different. Like, he's one of the only cultural figures I don't have just an automatic feeling of distrust about yet. Maybe it'll come, but so far it seems to be that it was just something there that he was always. And I think that's why I think we've talked about this, or I have with somebody, that why he failed in France was because he couldn't make the transition from a self-explorer and a self-questioner to a demagogue or whatever, somebody who's actually going to teach. He couldn't make that transition. So, I don't know what I'm trying to get at here, but certainly it's in my own method. I'm aware, obviously, what I'm doing has the semblance of criticism of our culture. And so it could be mistaken for an attempt to expose and reform and these things. It could even become that. But I wouldn't necessarily feel good about that. And I only really trust in what I'm doing insofar as I can see the evidence that it is helping me to become more oriented towards reality in my own life. So it is, it's like trying to break the spell. I'm trying to break the spell of something, and I'm aware that there's a finger trap in that. There's a Chinese psyche trap in that, because if I keep analyzing the thing I'm trying to get free of, then that might be the way that it keeps fixated on it.
Totally get that.
Yeah. Right.
And that's that thing again where I identify, and it's where I also feel a certain empathic concern. That so there's a moment, there's the section in Prisoner of Infinity that I began thinking about paranoid critical theory, and went looking for your term, which wasn't actually in the section but in the back of the book, the cultural engineering. It's in a little postscript to Prisoner of Infinity, is what you described the book as, and probably the very back. Strange place for it to be.
Right.
And that's where I'd actually read this thing about cultural engineering. I can't remember the exact way you describe it, but it was when you chose to kind of analyze Strieber's dream memories of abduction and violation. You sort of like you adopt a mode, and you tell the reader it's a risky thing to do, but you're going to fuse Strieber's, not quite fuse, but run Strieber's memories. You're going to interpret Strieber's. You do a kind of psychoanalysis of Strieber's memories of his father and the photographs and these memories he recovered during meditation, with your own memories of the scenario that I think you had also through meditation. It was a lucid memory of the kind of the grove where the abductees are doing things, and then you're in the dream with the car, with the candles on the dashboard, and I think those are in the same sections, if my memory serves me correctly. But for me, and this returning back to my own unrealized or unknown methods, that these are precisely the kind of methods that I would call paranoid critical methods, that you're allowing your own unconscious to riff through and with the text you're reading, and allowing something to emerge. You're allowing you're allowing something to happen. You're kind of going into a kind of trance. Maybe that's pushing it too far, but there's something about that method, to choose that method, to allow yourself to uncover your own memories and reflect on your own memories in relationship to another writer and their reflections on their own memories. You kind of fuse, you do the same thing you did, if you don't mind me saying so, in many ways with Latham and Dick, which is this symbol of the vesica
viscous, yeah,
viscous, right? Where the mind meld, the fusion, you enter into, and you refer to it as chapel perilous again. There's a kind of risky space of interpsychic communication on a level which is certainly off the normal level of what a writer does in a book. I mean, that's what's exciting about it. It's like, let's go into this experiment here. And when you're in that space, you're doing something that not many writers do in books. And that's what I really appreciate. That's what I see as a paranoid critical method. Like, you are doing something which is uncertain, experimental, risky, certainly, not a conventional writing method. And yet that's what makes it really exciting to me. And it is like Phil would do similar things, and it is a bit like surrealist experimentation too. I would say it's a little bit like the Exquisite Corpse, the risking of the losing oneself in the writing. So
yeah, well, it's because it's also like active imagination, isn't it, as well? I'm trying to let the writing process go where it needs to go so I can discover what it is I'm trying to discover. So that's why I say it's trying to get closer to the real, using writing to do so. And the most tangible risk is not a high risk, but feels pretty high, is that I can't finish the book. I can't, it's going to leave me in some way that won't be containable.
Yeah, but that's what's so impressive about it, because I can't finish books. I can barely get books started. You write books. You have absolutely the capacity to write books. You've written 3 books, the trilogy on this, around this these areas. You can write. You generate books. You produce them. So it's like it's a strange risk in the sense that you're able to do it, but it still feels risky, but it works. You write books, you finish books.
Well, it works.
You get to the end.
It works at that level, yeah. So you read Vice of Kings. Did you finish Vice of Kings, or did you jump to?
I'm halfway through Vice of Kings. I stumbled. I kind of ran the ground on Vice of Kings.
Okay.
And I started reading Prisoner of Infinity, which I'm finding more compelling.
Yeah.
I think because, like Seen and Not Seen, it has an experimental method in parts. It exposes the experiment and the risk of the writing more, at least so far, than Vice of Kings. Vice of Kings seems like you kind of plotting a map of all these interconnected potential connections between all these organizations that your grandfather and father and extended family and their associates may have been involved in, and you draw a big kind of paranoid map, or a paranoid critical map. I'd say it's a kind of, it could be accused of being paranoid, but as Burroughs said, a paranoid is a person in full possession of the facts. I've always liked that quote.
Well, yeah. So I mean, that's interesting because what I try to do with Vice of Kings, and I suppose the other book, Imprisonment too, but is to present the facts in such a way that the reader will become paranoid, without me having to be paranoid for him, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I am paranoid, so I can't. The fact is I'm looking for facts because I'm paranoid already. Right?
Well, the relationship, again, this is part of it, that the idea of paranoia and what it is to be paranoid and is a crucial question.
Yeah.
And my sense so far, and I haven't finished Vice of Kings, is that it becomes too much of a stretch for me. I mean, it's the connections that you draw. I understand that one can draw connections between people, organizations. I think I've said this before. I think there are no more than 6 degrees of separation between any idea and any other, any historical event and any other, any organization and any other. I think there's almost like a nodal network that there is just something of the let's say a neuronal net of connectivity means that everything can be connected to everything else with only a few moves. And I feel that Vice of Kings kind of demonstrates that to me, in a way that doesn't feel, I just feel, okay, I could connect everything to everything else. And it doesn't have the same kind of risky writing method and entering into your own memories and unconscious. It isn't as seductive or as trippy or as deep as the other two books. Maybe it gets so later on.
I mean, it's different. The second part's different. It's about Crowley. So, what was I thinking now? Because, I mean, I'm aware with Vice of Kings. I mean, I was aware of trying not to reach in that way. So only 1 degree of separation. Like if I had to go to 2 degrees, okay, I need to drop that thread, right? Because of what you're saying. Like, yeah, you can make anything look like it's connected because everything is connected, but you've got to leave out lots of other things that are also connected. Obviously, I was doing that. I was only following the threads that were confirming, what it was that I was trying to confirm. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known which way to go. I'd had to have a certain sense. Well, I was looking for connections to child sex abuse, to organized child sex abuse. That was the thing. Also, Jimmy Savile. Can I connect this to Jimmy Savile? Right. So, in a certain sense, it was arbitrary. On the other hand, it's not. Like that is a method. You have a thesis, and then you try and find the evidence to support your thesis. Interestingly enough, this latest book I've written, I feel as though I couldn't actually start with a thesis. Not really. I just had to find more and more evidence and then try and deduce what the thesis was from the evidence about Hollywood. And it's twice as long as any other book or these other books. And then when it came time to try and sum it up, I found that it was very difficult. Like, what is my thesis? It is like They Live. It's like, the whole of reality has been constructed around us, and Hollywood is one of the primary instruments of that spell casting. And that's not a thesis, it's too broad, right? So I'm not sure about Vice of Kings anyway. Obviously, I'm not sure in terms of what it's pointing at. My hope was to try not to, like you're saying that it sounds as though you're saying that there's a certain degree of imposition there that you're resisting. Like he's saying all these things are connected. Well, I don't believe it, kind of thing. But what I was hoping to do there was not exactly connect things, but put them side by side and then see if the picture was coherent, as in with a jigsaw puzzle. You don't want to try and force them together, but if you put them all close together and you say, okay, that is green next to green, right? There is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really dependent, and maybe this is paranoid critical theory, I don't know, it's really dependent on, on whether at the end of putting all those somewhat random elements close together, it does create a picture. And then, of course, having to decide, well, how much am I just an AI program to see a dog face, and how much is there actually a dog face?
Exactly. And that is paranoid critical theory. And that's precisely it. I mean, the pareidolia, the idea of seeing into something. I mean, it's like this example of I don't know if you've seen this, is one of these TED Talks. I can't remember the guy's name, but he plays some incomprehensible series of noises. And then you listen to it and you can't tell what they are. And then he plays somebody saying what that incomprehensible noise is, that's been distorted and made into noise from a perfectly comprehensible sentence in English. And once you've heard this sentence in English, you can then hear the sentence in the noise, the same noise. So it's like, it's the same as, if you do a lot of automatic drawing and suddenly, I've had this happen, I'll give you the example that, suddenly you see the face of a witch and you can see the witch, but no one else can see the witch until they see the witch. Mm-hmm. And then when they see the witch, the witch was always there. They can't not see the witch. Mm-hmm. So seeing the witch into a scramble of lines is a little bit, that is an example of the kind of the problem that paranoid critical theory is struggling with. So you draw all these connections between these various organizations and figures involved with lots of different organizations around your childhood and your family and those networks. And you see, I haven't got to the end of the book, but I'm assuming that it's something to do with organized child sexual abuse with a Crowleyite twist.
It's just something to do with that. Yeah. What point did you hit the ground, or whatever, however you described it, run out of steam?
I think I was running out of steam. I think it was to do with the Soviet connections, to the Soviet business connections with your grandfather's. He was traveling to and from the Soviet Union, and
that's quite early on then.
Maybe I can't remember exactly how far I got, but
before Jimmy Savile comes in.
Well, Jimmy Savile comes in all the books, and you have the same paragraph, which I quote to people, which I find very amazing, is his list of honors, that there's the Knight's Malta. I don't know if it's in all the books, but certainly.
I think in all three books there's a summation of his, because some readers are not familiar with him. So
it's incredible. That is shocking, and remarkable and very provocative. It's a very thought-provoking list of honors that he received from mm-hmm. considering everything we now know.
But you hadn't got to Kinsey. You didn't get to Kinsey, say Alfred Kinsey and
the sex experimentation stuff, and I can't remember. I think I just about got to Kinsey.
Okay, so that's further on. So, well, because this is.
I'll carry on. I will carry on.
But
it just.
That's obviously up to you whether you carry on or not, and I'm not going to be offended if you don't. But only a little bit. But
it's interesting to know where you run out of enthusiasm, isn't it?
And because this is obviously an obstacle I'm coming up against now with this latest book. This is too much for people to take on. And maybe it's related. What was I going to say? So, do you think it's because it's one thing to say, well, it's just not as compelling? That's fair enough, and I would even agree that Prisoner of Infinity is a better book and a more compelling book, and so on. But is it? Do you think it's also because? I mean, I guess my hope is with and my experience with Vice of Kings is in that first part is that, I mean, and this is with this new book too, I'm building a case very slowly. And so my hope is that each chapter will just provide information that in itself is interesting and compelling and new, and sometimes shocking, as in the case of Kinsey, without there being a need to tie it all together. And
Yeah.
but okay, I am tying it together. It's all in the book, but you're suggesting that you have a resistance against that, and I'm wondering if that's to do with something, feeling that it's being imposed upon you, or if you think it's innate in yourself that you just don't want to go there.
Oh no, it's definitely not. I don't want to go there. I'm quite happy to. I don't think so anyway. I think there are a couple of things in Vice of Kings which, I've spent quite a lot of time at Braziers Park. I know the School of Integrative Social Research, not but and I know some of the history of that community, the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry, the kind of these which are to me very sort of well-meaning middle class, ecologically conscious utopianists who were trying to build a better society.
Mm-hmm.
It may be that hidden in that, somewhere like Braziers Park is a deeper, darker current of child abuse. And certainly, I think if I remember correctly, there may have been things you found in Marianne Faithfull's diary or Marianne Faithfull's early lyrics talking about
Memoir,
because her memoirs and I suppose on that level, what I would say is I don't necessarily. It doesn't necessarily follow to me that a sexually liberated culture that was, came out of the 1920s and 30s. I say sexually liberated in inverted. What I'm trying to say is that the permissive culture of the 1960s, its relationship to the occult, more satanic practices of Crowley is where that's where something happens for me cognitively and in terms of what I know about things. I haven't done the research you've done, but I think the idea that any kind of permissive sexuality, or to generalize that permissive sexuality from the 1930s, 40s and 50s, or whenever it's happened, is somehow inextricably tied up with Crowleyite sex magic, is something I'm not being able to entirely give credence to.
Right. So is that in the prose itself, though, or is that because it's in a book where all these things are being put together?
My sense is that there's an implication being made in the book that a whole complex network of social movements and belief systems and new philosophies and experimental ways of living and ways of trying to do things, which you can see through the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry and all sorts of occult organizations, and that Crowley was certainly involved with, as were others, Blavatsky, Theosophy. You could join the dots between a lot of belief systems, a lot of organizations, a lot of experimental communities, a lot of historical figures who may have been involved in those. But to infer from those connections and those relations that there might be an all-encompassing sexual satanic conspiracy of sorts is the bit that I find implausible.
And is that in the prose, though, or is that in
It's the inference I get from the prose.
From the prose, not just the packaging and the fact that you know what.
Oh, no, it's the inference from the prose. It's your thought process.
Okay.
I mean, I'm following your thought process. That's what I do when I read a book.
Right.
I feel like that's why it works for me. So that's why I enjoyed the section in Prisoner of Infinity where you do the Chapel Perilous experiment with, Strieber's memories and your own. That's a much more exciting piece of experimental writing and fiction, or not fiction, like exploring the limits of fiction, which doesn't happen, at least so far, in Vice of Kings.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, you could say that's a stylistic criticism or something, but you could also say that element leavens the rest of it and makes it less of a polemic if there's more of an experimental, subjective aspect.
Yeah, and there's also your polemic against your obvious, polemic or case against your family.
Mm-hmm.
You have a case against your family that may or may not, like if there's a case against your family, let's say, for exposing you to sexual abuse at an early age because of the kind of people that they invited into your house, that is a transgression, on their part, highly, questionable and immoral or whatever, they negligent. But to then build a structure of complex, interdependent, stacked hierarchies of systematic, organized abuse, going from United Dairies through to the Soviet Union, through to the OSS and Gregory Bateson, which is also some point at which we have contention around some of the readings around cybernetics and that stuff. But it seems like a very baroque edifice to build on a potentially traumatic experience from your childhood due to the negligence of your parents.
Except that I was interested in building that evidence before I even began to suspect there was anything in my own childhood. Could say building it, I would say more like uncovering it. I mean, I hope I'm not building any. I mean, obviously I can't avoid it, but I hope this is back to the imagination again, isn't it? I hope I'm not just using the imagination to create images of what I want reality to be, but to actually excavate the hidden areas of reality. And so yeah, so what Vice of Kings wants to be, or what it aspires to be, is a juxtaposition of the microcosm of my own life with the macrocosm of British society and beyond. And that, like, my family weren't Satanists. My family were well-meaning, decent people, intelligent and interested in the right things and all the rest of it. I'm not saying that they were actually malevolent, but the neglect and the naivety and the unwitting allegiance or alliance with malevolent groups and agendas, and even that's kind of questionable. Are they malevolent? Was the pedophile information exchange malevolent? Depends. I mean, nowadays for most people would say it was, because they're pedophiles, and we think of pedophiles as evil beings, right? But actually, well, back then, pedophiles, the homosexuality had just been normalized or was in the process of being whatever, recontextualized. So they just thought, well, why not us too? So, and anyway, without getting into the specifics of that, because it's so sensitive, I don't see that there's any more than in my family that there was a clear dividing line between ignorance, naivety, and neglect, and what's something closer to satanic malevolence, or that allows those satanically malevolent elements access. I don't think there's any more of a clear dividing line in society at large. So, I mean, I was very aware that I was mapping something that there's already a kind, and I don't have the language for this. I use the term strange attractor sometimes, but there's like I guess there are like internal structures of belief and thought that exist, that if we present certain perspectives and evidence and data, there's a tendency they'll just naturally get pulled into that pre-existing framework. And so what I'm talking about here is the grand conspiracy framework, that we all kind of have that sense, even if we don't believe in it, we have that sense of what it looks like, that narrative. There is a grand conspiracy that brings together Tavistock and CIA and OSS and all these other different agencies. And so I was very aware that much of what I was mapping could easily be mapped onto that structure, and so there's going to be a tendency for people just to naturally fit it into that framework, whether they believed or disbelieved. And so that's part of what the project is, I think, is to try and create or discover a different internal structure by which to understand that, which I call complicity, but it's more complex than complicity. It's manufactured complicity. I'm paraphrasing Chomsky there, aren't I? But and yeah, it's absolutely a problem. I mean, I guess I probably don't address it as much as I could have done. But of course, the danger is then the book is full of qualifiers and disclaimers. Oh, I'm not saying the Braziers Park, etc. Right? And I don't want to have to keep doing that.
I get you, yeah.
And it's an interesting example because the Braziers Park did, they contacted me after that chapter, or because of that chapter on the blog, and they invited me to talk at Braziers Park. And I said, well, you do know what this is about, don't you? And I was quite surprised, and I never really found out whether they realized the context within which I was talking about Braziers Park or not. But I mean, it would be a great opportunity to, I mean, if they do.
Well, we could organize that. We do something there every year at this festival called Supernormal, and we have a summer school that we do at Braziers. So, it's like, it's a long story, but I've done research into the history of Braziers. They're very kind of, in my opinion, they're really quite benign people. They're kind of Quakers. It's a very Quaker organization, and another Quaker. I'm sure you've got some dirt on the Quakers, but I'm quite. What's that?
My grandfather's a Quaker.
Yeah.
So the Quakers are in there, but actually I couldn't find much dirt on the Quakers. Although they definitely pop up. And they did seem to be an example of something that seemed to be benign, but then that either wasn't or got co-opted, such as the introduction of mental hospitals that actually were a bit more humanitarian.
Yeah.
You can see, well, how could that possibly be a bad thing? But those mental hospitals later developed into the kind of experimental milieux for MK Ultra.
You see, that's the kind of reasoning where I kind of have to sort of go, well, I'm from York. There's the big, the Retreat, very famous open hospital. Can't remember who developed it, but it's famous in the kind of development of non-coercive treatment for the insane. That they needed to they needed to have grounds, that they needed to be not tied to beds and forced to have freezing baths, etc., etc. They should be given convivial environments, be fed well, and allowed to recuperate in nice surroundings. Now, it may well be that those same asylums or places of sanctuary for people with mental health issues at some point were co-opted and taken over by people who did experiments such as psychic driving experiments and MK Ultra. But I would certainly never, want to put that at the feet of the Quakers or the people who set those hospitals.
No, you wouldn't want to do that, but you wouldn't want to rule it out either. You wouldn't want to rule out that an agenda like that could start early on and say, okay, in order to get here, we've first got to go here, here, and here.
Yeah, maybe, but this is a bit like, it's interesting that Foucault comes up. Like Foucault wrote about that hospital in York. It was Tuke who's the guy that set that up. But anyway, it was famous for this alternative, benign, the beginning of the therapeutic approach to mental health. But of course, Foucault is also famous in Discipline and Punish for pointing out that, in a way, the open prison is more repressive than the, good old, stocks and, being hung, drawn and quartered or something. Like there's this idea that the new benign regime of liberal capture of the soul is more repressive or violent, or equally or repressive and violent in another way than the subjugation of the body. That's basically the thesis of Discipline and Punish, that these new regimes.
He was a sadomasochist, so he probably had his own.
Well, he may well have done. That's right. But I'm just. I guess I'm trying to say that organizations get taken over by ideologies and agendas with different leadership, different organizations, different political climates, different developments in theories and bodies of knowledge about practices. And that I don't assume that the seeds of malevolence are necessarily sown by benevolent causes or by benevolent intent.
The road to hell.
Huh.
I think that is part of my thesis. I think that the desire or the focus on social reform never ends well. I think that is central to my thesis.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the book and sort of maybe approach it from that perspective. But to me, that can endorse, or can endorse is the wrong word, but it can be a kind of nihilism. There's a nihilism in assuming that that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that all attempts to do good or improve the world inevitably lead to its.
Not if it's true, though. I mean, I'm not saying it is, but if it is true, then it wouldn't be nihilistic to uncover that truth. It would just be helpful.
I suppose so.
Right.
Well, maybe so. I guess I guess I come from a tradition of thinking, critical thinking, which is so keen on demonstrating all the hidden violences and structural violences of systems which claim to be beneficial to people. I mean, it's the kind of critical theory, right? That I suppose I've started as I've got older to think, maybe it's just better for people not to be locked up for 24 hours a day in cells, and to be given more time to enjoy things. I don't know. Well,
isn't it
prison reform might be a good thing.
Isn't it the problem of either or thinking, and also that everything has to be put in the context of what's right for society or what's good for individuals rather than simply what's true? Isn't this part of the problem? Because I mean, that's a context that limits it very much. I mean, I was just reading Jacques Ellul, and this is something I confront in the works of Bertrand Russell, actually, but he's saying the danger, if he just writes the facts about propaganda, that people will interpret that he's endorsing these things. because of the nature of the way that we think now is that if you talk about something neutrally, then there's a tendency to believe that you're actually endorsing that. And I think it can also go the other way, that there's just all, I think it's kind of like that test of the Eisenstein test or whatever, where they showed a picture of a face and then they juxtapose it with a different image, and then the face looks different according to, you know, what the following image is. We project onto that face whatever it is that, you know, because it's blank enough, we can project our own perceptions onto it. That there's something about presenting evidence, or I guess it is evidence, information about society, that if it is neutral or more neutral, we project onto it, you know, either it's approval or disapproval. And I'm not saying I'm neutral. Obviously I'm not. I try and put my bias front and center, however, by including my own history and all the rest of it. And then I try and compensate for that. Oh, okay, so I'm going to be inclined to see this way, so I need to look extra hard to make sure that I'm not just, it's not just pareidolia that's happening here. But it may be that, I mean, I know that I am too neutral for most people when I write about these things, because they want a position, they want a clear position.
I get that.
A judgment against, right? So for some people, I'm too neutral on one, you know, I'm not condemnatory enough, or I'm not making it clear enough what I'm saying. Yeah, there is a conspiracy here. But then for other people, such as yourself, you know, it's too much like that. So I think that's one of the problems that I have in terms of trying to actually negotiate the space between two opposing perspectives. It's curious that critical theory, you're saying that you were already immersed in this kind of non-paranoid view of society that nonetheless is constantly
distrusting. You know, it's what hermeneutics of suspicion, as it was called. You know, Freud, Marx, and whoever else it was. You know, that Nietzsche, that, you know, has a philosophical outlook on the world that doesn't trust it, that is constantly looking for deception, that is constantly looking for false consciousness and reification and all sorts of machinations of unfair power systems that you must expose and criticize and demystify, continually demystifying everything, you know, challenging things which are apparently morally good and benign and exposing them as actually, you know, deeply evil at a different level that people aren't conscious of. These are the methods and the general approach of what I understand critical theory to be doing, especially Marxist critical theory.
And it's what goes around comes around, because they're now that, whatever we would call that school of thought and that tradition is now under scrutiny by paranoid thinkers as being a big Marxist cultural conspiracy.
Yeah, and the whole cultural Marxism trope of the alt-right, which, you know, is very evident, and there's another thing. There's lots of loops around this. You know, cultural Marxism is what it gets called by right-wing nationalistic neo-Nazis.
Well, not just. I mean, I'm not sure how many.
No, but that specific term. I mean, I think we've discussed this, but the specific formulation of cultural Marxism is the conspiracy theory of the Frankfurt School. Basically, it's the conspiracy version of the Frankfurt School. Is its deep root. Yeah. The Frankfurt School is a Zionist conspiracy of Marxist Zionists who are trying to bring down Western civilization and corrupt the minds of the youth.
I mean, you might be chunking up there, because I don't know enough about it, but I'm pretty sure that Jordan Peterson has talked about cultural Marxism, and I doubt, if so, that he's called it a Zionist
It's
conspiracy.
he precisely hasn't called it a Zionist conspiracy because he doesn't know where that meme is coming from. He's absorbed it from the alt-right. It's very clear when he met with Slavoj Žižek, when Slavoj Žižek called him on it. I mean, I've been tracking this for a while now because it's a long story, but Michael Minnesino, New Dark Age, there's a whole lot of stuff that's been around for 10, 15 years now, where this conspiracy theory about the Frankfurt School took the form of cultural Marxism. That's the formula it took. And you can see that meme, the conception of that meme running through alt-right discourse. They don't talk about the Frankfurt School, they talk about cultural Marxism.
Right.
And it became a meme within that discourse. So that's evident. I was doing the work, but I just thought, who cares? It's all out there on the internet if you cared to look for it. But the reason I'm bringing that up is that there is already a kind of conspiracy theory of the Frankfurt School linked to very explicitly to alt-right politics, what gets called alt-right, but it's called the internet of the alt-right. And Jordan Peterson was using it. And his choice to call it cultural Marxism was very telling. And when challenged on the notion of cultural Marxism by Slavoj Žižek, Peterson was unable to give one example of a writer that embodied this notion of cultural Marxism. He didn't know what it was really. He's caught the meme. He'd caught the meme. I'm not saying that makes Jordan Peterson an advocate of the alt-right or a nationalist or a neo-Nazi or anything. Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is he'd caught the meme.
Right. It's a complicated stew, and I mean, I thought with Vice of Kings, maybe I could ride that wave. I wanted to put socialism, I was supposed to be Fabian socialism in the title because of all this, the growing skepticism about socialism, or the growing, I could even say scapegoating, but obviously I wouldn't want to participate in scapegoating, but the growing tendency to identify socialism as some hidden, force of conspiratorial manipulation in our society. I thought, oh, well, I can add something to the discussion here. But at the same time, I was aware, and I'm increasingly aware, that there's always a danger there in trying to cater to an audience, is that one's work will then become, not necessarily weaponized, but it will get incorporated into these structures, referring to the pre-existing structures. I mean, insofar as one has a successful book, it has to be familiar and compatible enough that people can incorporate what they already believe, right? If it completely undermines what they believe, they're not going to be able to read it or want to read it. So there's a real tightrope to walk there in terms of how much can you really challenge people's perceptions and introduce them to new possibilities, while at the same time being compatible with what they already think they know, so that they won't reject it entirely. And the whole thing around conspiracy obviously is really central to what I do, and I'm so much pulled both ways. Like
Process. Blissful abyss.
I'm not so sure.
Is this what we're waiting for?
I'm not so sure.
Blissful abyss.
Please don't tell me more.
Are we our own predator?
I'm not so sure.
Less or more, I am not so sure, but I guess the wisdom of my senses will explore and then assess.